go. Let's go. Follow my hand. Let's go. Let's go. Stop. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Hey, look. Hey. Head to the left. Gotcha! I ain't got long to be here. Later! I ain't got long to be here. Look here! I ain't got long to be here. One kill right now. We gonna say, we gonna say, we gonna say, we gonna say, let's go, let's go, let's go, look here, we gonna only be here, look here, I ain't got long to be here. Look here! I ain't got long to be here! Follow me! Let's go!
Brother!
Let's go! Let's go! Let's go! Look! Come this way, y'all. Come this way. Y'all ready? Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Look here. I ain't got long to be here. Let's go. I ain't got long to be here. Look here. I ain't got long to be here. While I'm here. Y'all ready? Y'all ready? Y'all ready? Let's go. Look here. I ain't got long to be here. Look here. I ain't got long to be here. Look here. I ain't got long to be here. But while I'm here, y'all ready?
Yes!
Y'all ready? Y'all ready? When we think, well, when I think about the ways in which I've utilized my art to activate, or in terms that I use artivate. I do that all by myself sometimes. I say something and I start laughing because it brings me joy. And I always thinking about a moment in my art where it was more than just me expressing what I was feeling. Where it became, oh, you can apply purpose to this expression. I wish I had a church right now.
Right now.
I said, I think about the moment when I decided, oh, I could put some purpose with this expression. Come on, somebody know this. Nia. And it was very real simple. I was at a school on the south side of Chicago.
South side.
I know. That was on 71st Street. And for those who are not familiar with the geography of Chicago or the rubric that Chicago is, 71st Street is named after a brother by the name of Emmett Till Jr. And I was in this school, and I was in a classroom of 7th to 8th grade boys. And I mentioned Emmett Till or the name, and they looked at me like, "What you talking about, Willis?" And I'm looking at them like, "What you talking about, Willis?" The name right there on you see his name every day. You encountered his name and they didn't know who he was. They didn't know why it was important that the street was named after him. And so I'm like, "Dang, Gino." I'm like, "Dang. I gotta figure out how I can do what I do to make sure they remember him." Thank you. And understand the significance.
Please.
So, it just so happened that weekend that Mamie Till, Ashe, was in the newspaper for a documentary that had just came out about the murder of Emmett Till. So, I pretty much figured that no one would mobilize this particular school or this particular audience to get into any movie theater to see this documentary. But I had access to the school and again this room of 7th and 8th grade boys to do this thing. So if you all don't mind, we are going to perform this piece called Emmett Till the Remix. Is that cool? Is that cool? MISSISSIPPI. Were you there when they did what they did to that boy? Were you there when they did what they did to that boy? Were you there when they snatched him out his uncle's house? Were you there when they snatched him out his uncle's house? Oh Lord, were you there when they brought him to the wife? Were you there when they brought him to the wife? Is this him? 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 My Lord, is it him? 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 Oh, were you there? Were you there when they brought him to the barn? Were you there when they brought him to the barn? Were you there when they brought him to the barn? Were you there when they brought him to the barn? Were you there when they picked up a brick and played touchdown with them face? Were you there when they picked up a brick and played touchdown with them face? Oh, were you there when they picked up a brick and played touchdown with them face? Were you there when they picked up a brick and played touchdown with them face? Oh, were you there? Were you there when the mama got the call? Were you there? Were you there when the mama got the call? Hey, 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 got image. They got image. Hey, got image. Hey, they got image. Hey, got image. Were you there? Were you there when they showed the mother, they showed her son? Were you there? Oh, were you there when they showed the mother, when they showed her son? Were you there? See us great. Till I got weak in me. Oh, were you there? Hear her scream, y'all. Hear her scream. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Till I got weak in me. Oh, were you there? See God's children, see them all dressed in black. Oh, were you there? See all God's children, see them all dressed in black. Were you there? Hear brothers cry, see sisters scream. Oh Lord, oh Lord, were you there? Hear brothers cry, see sisters scream. Oh, were you there? Were you there? Hear that white boy brag about what he had done. Were you there? Were you there? Hear that white boy brag about what he had done. Hey, I got me a nigga. Got me a red bone nigga, a green eyed nigga, a stuttering nigga. But that's what I'm getting. That's what I'm getting for whistling that white wind. That's what I'm getting. Were you there? Were you there? See somebody wade the water all night long. Were you there? Smell somebody wade the water all night long. Were you there? Hear somebody wade the water all the night long. Were you there? Were you there? Feel somebody wade the water all night long. Oh, were you there? Were you there? When the jury came back and said not guilty. Were you there? Were you there when the jury came back and said not guilty? Were you there? Are you here? Juries keep coming back, said not guilty. Were you there? Are you here? Juries keep coming back. Juries keep coming back. Juries keep coming back. Said not guilty. Now tell me, who gonna run then? Who gonna raise images? Who gonna march the inmate? Who gonna write the inmate? Who gonna stand the inmate? Roll to the side to sit for him. Roll to the side to sit for him. Well, I'll lead aside to fight for him. I'll lead many in his mind to fight for him. One day, on 71st Street, I decided to write for him. Tell me, who gonna die for him? Who gonna live? 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 Who gonna live?
Okay, well, hi Bernadine.
Hi, Erica.
It's good to see
You're
you.
almost done. It's nice having you.
I know, here we are, right?
Yeah.
It's an honor to sit here with you, a woman I have admired for many, many years for your fierceness and grace. So I'm really excited to have a conversation with you. So when Lisa first asked for us to begin by talking about our personal relationship to questions of incarceration, I thought, I have nothing to say. I'm going to ask Bernadine a bunch of questions and kind of step aside. But when I was reflecting upon this opportunity to talk about this question amongst the Imagining America community, I realized I do have something to say. So I'm going to start with a short story, and the story does end with a whole bunch of questions for Bernadine. I was born in 1968 in Berkeley, California, the same year that you were arrested multiple times for peace and political and anti-imperialist protests. At that same year, my father, Herb Cole, who this is the first time I have publicly ever on stage said my father, Herb Cole, so there's a little bit of an outing. I'm turning 50 and I'm not sure why. I think it's either because he's been such a troublemaker his whole life or because he casts a very large shadow. So probably a bit of both, but that same year, my father, Herb, received a grant from the Carnegie Foundation to create a storefront alternative school. So schooling and education and liberatory teaching was also deeply a part of the freedom struggles of the 60s. And he received a grant from the Carnegie Foundation for him and Alan Capro of the Happenings to create a storefront school. They named the school Other Ways, and that's what it was. It was about teaching and learning in other ways for kids who dropped out or were kicked out of the Berkeley and Oakland school district. That, for me as a little kid, as I grew up from the late 60s through the early 70s, was magic. And to me, those moments were about mess and justice and freedom and protests, and the pedagogy of the school was like learning about consumerism by doing, happenings in supermarkets, and learning about science by running around Tilden Park, and then going to a farm worker protest outside of a Lucky's in Berkeley, and it was a beautiful time. I've known you by family since then,
Right.
because my dad, and I asked him just about an hour ago, said he met Bill Ayers, your lifelong partner, in 1968, when you were a senior, I believe, at the University of Michigan. So we've been family on this journey.
We have. It's quite true. I mean, the thing that's interesting to me is that, to me, Erica represents the younger generation. Of course, everybody's younger than me. Probably everybody in this room is younger than me. And, it is so vital that we look forward and we look at the challenges today. I don't like living in the past, so I don't usually talk about the past. I'm willing to do it a little bit with Erica, but only because we're going to hurry up and get right to what the challenges are of today.
I have only a sliver more of the past until we get to today, because Bernadine, this is your beauty, is staying in the present moment and striving towards the future. So during this time, which led me in my reflections to this question of incarceration, was that I, as a very privileged, sheltered kid in Berkeley in the 60s and 70s, was proud that I knew that we were being surveilled. It was like a badge of honor that we were doing good work. I saw a policeman at my door, and it was kind of like, ha, kids answered the door to police. But I didn't understand. I really didn't understand at all the consequences and the connections to incarceration, to confinement, to imprisonment, and to an era where this mode of policing was turning into a much bigger movement of confinement. And I was thinking about my connection to this story in thinking about speaking with you, and I realized it was only 2 summers ago when my mom passed away, and we're looking through papers, and my dad pulls out this paper kind of jokingly, and it's a surveillance report, ironically not by any policing agency or the FBI, but by the Ford Foundation. And it's an undercover Ford Foundation agent, this is like well after my book is published, and I had no idea, following my family around as we go to all those beautiful dinner parties you talked about in your email to Lisa, and all those gatherings and potlucks and sessions. And for the first time, I had a pit in my stomach about being looked at through the lens of criminality, being looked at as also somehow unpure. Oh, those guys were all drunk. Herb was so drunk. The women weren't speaking. They say they have Panthers involved, but who's that guy, Arnold Perkins? And all of a sudden, reading those pages and seeing ourselves read through the lens of surveillance, which was really a bigger movement that the Ford Foundation was involved in co-opting and transforming and sometimes shutting down the storefront school and the radical school movement in the Bay Area in the 60s and 70s. So I say all this because as I was forced to think about my connection, which I can do politically, I can do structurally, I understand my connection to systems of incarceration, but personally when I started to have these thoughts, I started thinking about I could retell and rewrite my childhood as also growing up at that critical conjuncture when policing and surveillance was being transformed into the mass prisons we now see in California, right? That was the critical post-war moment that Ruthie Gilmore talks about, where ideologies of blaming radicals and people of color and the conjuncture of the funds of the sort of post-war military complex being removed out of California and the reorganizing of people and places through policing and legitimizing mass prisons in California. I could retell that story. So what I want to turn, yeah.
Let me interrupt for 1 minute. I think that it's important to note here, this goes way back before me, old as I am. So when you look at the history, say, of Jane Addams or Lucy Parson, let's go back to the Haymarket uprising and the African-American survivor of Albert Parsons, who was hung by the city of Chicago. The persistence of women militants and women organizers in the city of Chicago, and Jane Addams, who was an upper-class white woman, risking again and again in her long organizing life associations with socialists and communists, marching at the head of labor rights organizations, as well as having tea with the wealthy women of Chicago, and again refusing to stop, refusing the privilege that she came with, or challenging the privilege that she came with, and insisting on the power of women to change the world, really, but being in the streets with the workers as a way of doing it. And really the same is true around the struggles against lynching, which were a catalyst in Chicago, here in Chicago. And so I think that we have this incredible tradition to draw on, and Lisa Lee has brought that tradition to the forefront by remaking Hull House as a radical site and a radical center, and now by her incredible complex way of working in this inside Imagining America.
Thank you, Bernadine. I'm going to turn to this present moment because, many of you throughout this conference that we've heard in panels have talked about this moment as a moment of possibility, a moment of excitement. People are talking about abolition in different ways and in new spaces. Yet we can also look at this moment as a very difficult moment in which many folks are despairing and many people are trapped. And we're seeing the same patterns of policing and incarceration throughout this country, and add to that the feeling of sort of fascist, the fear of the impending doom of what's next. So can you talk, when you reflect on these historical moments and then bring yourself to now, can you talk about how you understand this moment of possibility?
Well, I will, but first I'm going to throw it back at the audience, because I think, it's every generation's challenge to name their historical moment. So in the mid-late 1960s, with the model in front of us of the Southern Civil Rights Workers, of SNCC and SCLC, and the people who faced dogs and sheriffs and disappearance and murder, coming up to now, you see that in that era, in that 5 or 10 year period, I thought, I'll just leave it with me, but I think many we's thought that this was a turning point in U.S. power in the world, a turning point of American imperialism. We became convinced that the United States was going to lose the war in Vietnam. There was no way the U.S. could win militarily, politically, culturally, the war in Vietnam. And so, but what a loss meant, of course, was not a happy ending exactly. Millions of people left dead on the battlefield, millions of soldiers in Vietnam and in the United States harmed and struggling for life, and also speaking out to power and throwing medals back at the government. So that era we saw as a turning point. We didn't think we'd be here now in this millennium, and we certainly didn't imagine, a neo-fascist president and crowds chanting "kill her." So it's not, certainly not a straight journey. On the other hand, U.S. hegemony is broken, and I think it's important for us to see that the voices of resistance coming out of the United States still carry tremendous weight and cut into that notion of total power and total authority and the fear cast by a president like Trump. So I don't want to name, we've just had wonderful 3 days of watching social struggles represent themselves and the growth of this from the bottom up and the organizing, literally the door-to-door organizing that's going on. Again, that's so critical, I think, to social change and to bringing new people in. Lots of people around the country look at Black Lives Matter, at Undocumented and Unafraid, at Standing Rock, and think, how do I get there? I remember this period when I was a student at the University of Chicago and the first occupation of the administration took place then, because I thought they were right. And I argued with my friends that the students that sat in around segregated housing on the south side of Chicago were right. But I had no way of imagining me being there. Do you know what I mean? I couldn't, from my own background, take that first step to be there. And I think I assume that there's millions of people in the United States that will step up, want to step up, and don't know how. And it's our job, through that kind of grassroots organizing, to bring people in and then to connect the issues. Those are the two challenges: to keep reaching out, to keep presenting the world as we see it, and at the same time to connect the issues. So if you come in around mass incarceration and the need for decarceration, you also see what's going on with climate change. It's not too much of a reach. You also see that if you can get in a car and drive to Wounded Knee when something like that happens, you want to do that.
So can you bring us to kind of what you're working on, the various movements that are coming together here in Chicago and nationally, and kind of centered around our conference theme that we're now reflecting on of decarceration, liberatory futures, transformative imaginations, and what would you call forth as the most important ideas, tactics, projects, movements that we should really now start thinking about as we move forth into our work beyond the conference?
Okay, that's too big for me, so I'm going to tell you two things. I'm following you all. But I'm going to tell you two things, really. One is I've spent the last 20 years really as part of a national network. It's hardly one person or me or even one institution, trying to, I don't know why we started at the deep end, but really trying to take away extreme sentences against youth by the legal system. So first of all, we set out to abolish the juvenile death penalty, and that took about 5 years. And I mean a network of 20 or 30 of us. And then the Supreme Court, in a case called Roper versus Simmons, abolished the juvenile death penalty. So then we were like, okay, life without possibility of parole. Who ever thought, what other country, only 2 other countries in the world have ever thought of incarceration for life without possibility of parole. Who can do that? Who would think of that as a sentence for juveniles, for kids, for anybody from the age of under 18? And we looked, and there were 2,500 people in prison for that sentence. Unspeakable, really. So we set out, the same network of people plus more, set out to abolish life without possibility of parole. And now it's abolished in 21 states. But that's taken us another 5 or 10 years. It's a slow process to go through the states. We're not going to win it in the Supreme Court anymore, although we got it whittled down. It has to be a murder charge and so on. But I think, that's one set of struggles. For me, this is not a realistic goal, but for me it's very realistic. I think we have to shut down the prisons. I look at Cook County Jail, which is a mile from here. It's just a mile and a half from here on the west side of Chicago. And if you go to court any day, I've been going to the Laquan McDonald, Jason Van Dyke trial here in Chicago. And if you go there, you just can't believe, scores and scores of courtrooms with almost entirely African American and Latino defendants in front of them, and a jail as part of this 15-block complex that holds today 6,000 people, primarily pretrial, primarily without bail in order to be released pretrial. It should be bulldozed, in my opinion. That whole area should be, people should be taken out. And then it should be the buildings, the history, the smell of it, the sweat in it should be absolutely bulldozed. And I said this once at a small meeting that Lisa Lee was at, and she was like, ooh, let's put together a committee from the neighborhood and artists and architects and redesign what could happen there. So she, of course, immediately had it into reimagining what that vast area on the west side of Chicago could become, especially with the knowledge of the people who live there. Parks, low-income, beautiful housing, transportation that gets you around the city, jobs, shops, etc. So that's just part of what I want, but those are some examples of what I want.
A kind of two-part question, and you can take it either way, but this, you started that brilliant vision by saying, some would say this is impossible, but I don't think so.
I really don't think so. And one thing I forgot to say is that when we set out to abolish the life sentences for kids and created a network, the same network you've been using in each state, maybe 60% of the juvenile population who was incarcerated in the United States are now all out on programs, living at home with their families, and some kinds of supervision often, but not always. And so watching this decarceration happen in a widespread way with youth makes it clear that what's the difference between an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old? There's no magic thing here that makes you a grown-up or an adult. And so I think it's doable. It's surprisingly doable. And once one state does it, the neighboring state is like, we're spending all this money, we're holding, anyway. And I also think, looking at Illinois, you could imagine the people who now work in prison all the time really being transformed into doing climate change work and putting up windmills and refitting houses. I just think there's so much work to be done if we don't think of it as jobs, but we think of it as work to be done. Then you can figure out how to turn that into jobs that people can actually work in and be trained in and go on to. But I think we just need to decarcerate across the board.
So can you tell us, you said, this isn't just me, this is this long haul work is coalitions of 20, 30 some groups on any particular initiative. So if we look at the long arc of the project of decarceration and shutting prisons, can you talk about some of the specific organizations, including some kind of framings and tactics along the way that lead to that longer arc of change?
Well, I'll give, you all probably have heard this because you've been in wonderful Chicago. But there, in Chicago, an incredible development has happened, which is some 36 or 38 organizations have come together and sat in meeting after meeting, interminable meetings, of course, and hammered out a 10-point program that they agree about. So this means everybody from Iraqi Veterans Against the War, to neighborhood organizations in Pilsen, to places on the northwest side, white working class communities. A whole range of activists have come together, really catalyzed by Black Lives Matter, who took to the streets the last 4 or 5 years and took to the brains and the hearts of people, doing the research, knocking on doors, finding out why people didn't want a $96 million police academy built in their neighborhood on the west side of Chicago, and what they would do with that money if it wasn't going to be a police academy. So we have these incredible models coming from young people in Chicago, undocumented and unafraid, turning the immigration rights marches 10 years ago into, a family celebration where children and grandparents and everybody was out in the streets saying, we are here, and no human being is illegal. and we have a right to be here. We are Chicagoans. We belong here. So these kinds of things in our back and in the present give me nothing but hope. I think it's an incredible opportunity right now for us to unite and hammering out connecting the issues. If we can't connect all 10 issues, we connect 2 issues right away so that we can, unify women's rights to safety, women's rights to equal pay. Where are we at with equal pay? Practically nowhere compared to when I first came into the movement. So basic things like that, jobs with meaning, and work across issues, because when you combine the issues, this is what happened in the mythic 60s, of course, is that the war and whatever else you were working on came together, and it was obvious that they were inseparable. And so it's still true today. When you connect the issues, you have to think about systems, and then you have to think pretty quickly along the way about revolutionary change.
Thank you, Bernadine. I got the note from Lisa that we're about to wrap, so if you could give us a final word of, I think many people want to know, words of wisdom for keep going for the long haul, how you keep your heart and your spirit and your mind and your body sustained to keep on the work over time.
Oh, I'm not a wise woman. I'm just not. I think that you have to assume, even if, other things tell you so, that you're going to have a long life. And you can't do everything at the same minute. And so you want to have a life where you take care of the elders and you're present when the elders need you to be there. And that may mean stepping away for a minute from what you do. Or you may want to work with children or be with children or live in a household with children. And that'll take total attention. But it doesn't mean that, so assuming you have a long life, why would you not go back to trying to do revolutionary work? Of course you would. It's at the heart and soul of what gives us meaning. And it keeps, I think I've never thought of imagining a life without it. I can't imagine. But that can be through teaching, it can be through healthcare, it can be through reimagining cities. And we have each other. What a wonderful group of people you've gathered here this week.
Thank you, Bernadine.
Thank you so much, Erica. All right, we're going to ask the next group of panelists to join us on stage with Bernadine. Bern, let's move the chair back. And as they are gathering here, I'm just going to read you a little poem by Marge Piercy, which really sums up, I think, the group of people that we've invited to join us in this plenary. It's one of my favorite poems by her. It's called "To Be of Use." The people I love the best jump into work head first, without dallying in the shallows, and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves an ox to the heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in the common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire must be put out. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums, but they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. Please join me in welcoming Sofia Cuevas, Vincent Delgado, Bernadine again, Danny Murillo, Sarah Ross, and Sophie Kupitz to the stage, the people who are doing the real work that needs to be done.
Is that working?
Now I have 2 mics, so here, I'm going to give one of them to you.
Thank you.
All right. So last night at the extraordinary performance of Time Alone, thank you, Judy Bush, for helping to bring this, Alessandro Camon. We heard Jack Morris and Dolores Canellis tell us that, hey, listen, with a lawyer and an activist and a storyteller, we can change the world. And so we've actually have that in the room, so I'm ready for some world-changing activity. We've gathered a bunch of people who've actually been in this conference, presenting on panels and talking to us throughout the weekend. But I wanted them to have a chance to share with you a little bit of their bio and what brings them to this work of decarceration. How does this work personally touch them in their lives, their family lives, or in their work and scholarship? And by way of sort of introduction, because I'm not going to introduce them, they're going to sort of self-introduce themselves. You want to start? Yeah.
Okay. My name is Ofelia Cuevas. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Chicano and Chicano Studies at UC Davis. Yay, Davis. I am also the faculty advisor of a student organization called Beyond the Stats, which is a group of formerly incarcerated and system-impacted students on campus, and I'm hoping to actually recruit faculty and admin too in that group at some point. My scholarship, I guess I'm considered a Marxist race scholar, and my work is kind of grounded in geography, legal theory, visual cultural studies, and political economic theory. It's all over the place a little bit. I've been doing my work on race and prisons and race and policing since the mid-90s, when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And I came to this work because in the 90s, in California in particular, and just again to kind of show how it is personal as a sixth-generation Mexican, U.S.-born Mexican person, this history of prisons and policing, especially in the state of California, has been very central to kind of the formation of my identity. Again, not just as somebody, as a Latina, but also as a Californian. It plays a very specific role, I think, in me, both as somebody who's experienced multiple generations of family who's been in and out of prison, but also as a first-generation UC undergraduate student, UC PhD student, and now UC faculty. And so that's all to say that, I have a very personal story attached to policing and prisons, but it isn't just personal. It is actually historical. And what I mean by historical, as a historical materialist, looking at California specifically, I'm not sure if any of you guys know this, because it sounds like, I feel like everybody already knows this. California from about 1853 to about 1983 had 12 state prisons. And then between 1983, and I'm sure you've probably heard some of this in terms of the development of the prison industrial complex, et cetera, California to me is really ground zero for it all, because from 1983 to about 2003, California built 28 state facilities on top of the 12. And so during the 90s, they were actually building a prison per year, right? And during that same time period, we built, as a state, one UC system, right? So there was this kind of incredible investment, ideological investment, economic investment, et cetera, to not only build these prisons, but fill these prisons. And what I feel like is happening right now, what I'm kind of in the middle of, is how this kind of history, and again, history that was made by choices, and I hope to talk about this a little bit later, choices by individuals on the grounds, the kind of voting we were doing in the 1990s, like 3 strikes, you're out, anti-affirmative action, Proposition 209, those of you who are Californians might remember the mid-90s when this was going on, that kind of investment now translated to about, 2.5 generations on the ground in California of people affected by the state prison system. Right now there's about 1.6 million Californians with a criminal record. And all those individuals have a personal story, right? It is personal, it affects their lives. And I am sure, because I've been in and out of panels this whole time, that you've heard those stories, because this conference, more than any other conference I've been to on prisons, has done an amazing presentation of those personal stories and those personal histories. So that's kind of where I got into this.
My name is Vincent Delgado. Is this on? This is on. Mm-hmm. I guess my official title is I'm a director of the program on sustainability in Costa Rica for the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University. And I rarely think about myself that way. I think of myself more probably first as a father, as a son, brother, and also, you know, like a great-great-grandson to somebody already passed, and hopefully, and a great-great-grandfather someday. And I think that those kinds of designations have probably pushed me in different places in my life. I started out after college. I just didn't know what to do, so I think it was during the wars in Central America, so I threw out, I got a round-trip ticket to Acapulco and threw out the return ticket, and we just kept going and ended up writing a lot about what was happening there. And then I came back, and I was a journalist for a long time, and then I started working with refugees because there was something going on there about how we welcomed people at that time. I think we're way beyond that now, that conversation. And founded a center for refugees in mid-Michigan, and somehow snuck into a university and started working there. I'm not sure exactly how it happened.
The undercommons.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. And when I became a father, and I was also a city councilman at the time in Lansing, I started getting really, really concerned about our future on the planet, as people, our values. And I'd been doing some work in Costa Rica and had built a network of farmers, indigenous communities, environmentalists, a bunch of other people. And I'd been working in mid-Michigan with adjudicated youth and refugee youth and lots of different people. And I decided it was time to go to Costa Rica and figure out for a while what they were doing and what they were concerned about around climate change, around sustainability. And the day I landed was the day Trump was elected. And it was a hard day because suddenly I felt, wait a second, I'm in the wrong country. How did this happen? And, but I think I was in the right place because I had a lot I needed to learn. And one of the main things I learned one day, and maybe we'll get into this, was I had a group of adjudicated youth with me from mid-Michigan working with a farmer and an activist, an environmental activist, and we were planting some trees. And for me, planting a tree is kind of cool, but it's also kind of like a tourist thing you do in Costa Rica, so I was like sitting back going, I don't know about this. And he came up to me and he goes, you know, we got a word for this. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, it's herida de vida. And it's only in Costa Rica they use this word. And when you translate that, it means wound of the earth. Mm. And so for me, I thought, well, what do you mean? And he said, what we do when we plant a tree is we dig, we dig a hole deep into the earth. And we're wounding the earth. We're wounding the microbes that are there, the things that give life to that location. But we're planting something in it that will grow strong, hopefully, and grow and become part of the earth, and a critical part of the earth. And he went on to talk about how when he does this thing, he can imagine the entire tree. He can see the animals in the tree. He can see it putting out oxygen. He can see it doing those things. And so for me, I think where I am now is really thinking about that engaging in wounds, engaging deep into fear and these difficult times, and trying to figure out how to grow those trees, how to grow a future out of what on its face looks bleak, but I think there are so many holes in the earth now, and there's so many things coming. And so that's what drives me.
Thanks. Danny, don't forget to hold your mic up there, taping it.
For sure. Hi, everybody. So pretty much, I guess, how do I come into this work? How has it touched me, my family, my community, right? So straight up, I'm a formerly incarcerated person. I served 14 years from the age of 16 to the age of 30. First time I was arrested, I was 8 years old for something I didn't do, but I remember the police officer telling me, I'm gonna take you to the station because I'm gonna prepare you for your future, right? And so, and then, it was about 5-6 years before I ever got arrested again because I got scared because of that, and I got my ass whipped by my parents. But then there came a time where, I was no longer afraid. At 13, 14, 15, I was on the street, part of a community that was engaged in violence against other community members, people who looked just like me, right? I ended up going to prison. And at 2003, I got arrested in 96. 2003, I got placed in solitary confinement and labeled a prison gang member because I had in my possession literature and drawings that reflected my cultural identity. I had a newsletter from the Chicano Mexicano Prison Project, which is an abolitionist newspaper in San Diego, and it has a Mexican flag. The Mexican flag is considered a symbol of a prison gang. So because I had that in my possession, I had some drawings with some Aztec drawings, and that my mother would send me on a calendar, and they use those as evidence for gang association. And another one was a confidential informant. You always got to have a confidential informant. That's how the investigation always begins, right, before they start investigating your gang status. Anyways, I go to solitary confinement, and at that time, in my mind, I'm still thinking, like, if you let me out right now, I'm going to go back home and continue doing what I was doing, what got me in here. Because I was still carrying a lot of anger and a lot of hate for people that have, hurt me, right? And when I get to solitary confinement, I end up in a place where, it was very supportive. There was people there that took an interest in me and seeing something that I failed to recognize myself, and that was my humanity. People in solitary confinement, like my homie Jack that was here last night. We're both from the same community, but he got arrested before I was even born. But I always knew who he was. And I remember when I was a kid, I tell myself, when I go to Pelican Bay, this is before even going to prison, in my mind, I was already going to Pelican Bay. And I would tell myself, when I go to Pelican Bay, me and Jack are gonna be cellmates. It never happened. I never seen him in Pelican Bay. We actually met out here. But anyways, for me, solitary confinement was my source of consciousness, but not because it was designed to do that to me. In spite of that, right? Solitary confinement is created to break you mentally, physically, and spiritually, right? And for me, I understood that going into solitary confinement, that it was designed to do that. And I was coming home. I wasn't a lifer, so I wasn't gonna be there for the rest of my life. So I told myself, you know what, I'm here for 5, 6, 7 years, and just, take the time to, figure out what's gonna be your next move, right? And little by little, my consciousness started changing and saying, look, I don't wanna be what I used to be. I wanna do something different. So, people encouraged me to do the GED, and then they encouraged me to do the community college, and I did all that. And when I came home in 2010, all I knew was that I didn't wanna go home. And I also had this mentality that as long as I make a positive impact in somebody's life, then I'm squared, right? I'm even. But, and that was my little brother. When I came home, my little brother was expecting me to come home and be that gang member, associated to, whatever, prison gangs and all that. And he would write me for about 3 years, like, when you come home, we're gonna sell drugs, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. And like, no, we're not gonna do that. And so now, the way that it has touched me is that I'm trying to do everything possible to get my brother out of that lifestyle, right? And so I was lucky enough that in 2013, not that my brother was lucky, but unfortunately he got arrested for a gun possession. And the first day of court, they offered him 5 years with 2 felonies, right? And they thought that maybe because he was, someone with no money, and but we got him a lawyer, we bailed him out, and we moved him up to Berkeley. And it was when he moved up to Berkeley that I would take him with me to all my lectures and my classes, and he got, he went back to adult school, got his high school diploma, went to community college, where he's in community college right now. And right now, he's already in the process of submitting his applications to transfer to UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UCLA, And so that's me doing the work at the micro level, but also at the macro level, I'm trying to create a statewide network of formerly incarcerated students and alumni in California, and trying to figure out how do we use our collective identity to push for policies and laws that are going to impact our communities in a healthy way.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to the other panelists for all the amazing work you all do. My name is Sarah Ross, and I think that I came to this work in many ways, as other people have described, but you know, I actually, something I don't often talk about a lot is I grew up in the South, in a small town, and my family wasn't from there, and so the world around me in the 1980s and early 90s was really, you know, radically segregated, and I feel like that my parents were always saying things that were trying to counter what we were hearing from our, you know, neighborhood, particularly. And so I think that work, that life growing up helped me think a lot about the aesthetics of exclusion, because I went on to be an artist and started to think about how our world is organized, you know, politically and aesthetically, to make people feel cared for and part of community or not. And I also did domestic violence work when I was young. I worked with people who identified as women who were surviving violence in their homes, and worked in a jail at that point, and was also just interested in the way that, or through those women, I learned that the jail was not a space for safety. It was not a space that was solving any harms that they had either done or had been part, you know, that they were the recipient of. And so those women, I think, helped and shaped and informed my life, or, you know, the sort of next steps in my life, which is that I went on to, you know, kind of just teach in a prison through a community college project. I just kind of answered a call. But because when I walked into a men's medium security prison in Central Illinois, even though I'd done, you know, had been interested in this work, I actually realized when I walked in, I knew nothing at all. And so I worked with other people and started a reading group and a screening group and did a lot of self-education, kind of trying to learn from people inside who are also doing tons of self-education, you know, outside the classes, that they were always educating themselves and others. So through that kind of long trajectory, I would say, I was interested in how art could couple with or how cultural production could couple with some of the issues in politics that were happening in the prison, and learned from other artists here in Chicago that were using, you know, images and performative works to challenge a solitary confinement prison, to challenge the torture of John Burge that he committed to people who are still in prison now. And so learning from those folks, I eventually worked with others to start a project at Stateville Prison, and the work that we do is multifaceted. One part we offer a college program, another part we do work with folks inside to try to develop ideas and politics that they want to see happen outside, and then we also have exhibitions, and we try to build work in the prison through the classes that are of concern to people in prison, and then bring that work outside to educate people about what's happening inside the prison, what are the issues that we need to know to decarcerate, and really just try to reverse sort of the flow of education that happens from inside to educate us on the outside.
Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie. First of all, I just want to thank you all for having me here. It's really been an honor to learn from and with you all over these past few days, because mainly I see myself as a student, and I really have learned a lot and am left thinking about a lot of things, and I'm excited to continue talking in this next little bit. I'm an undergraduate student at Brown University. I've TA'd with College Unbound in the Rhode Island prison, do anti-prison organizing work with a grassroots organization in Providence called DARE, Direct Action for Rights and Equality, and their Behind the Walls Committee, and I'm a student employee at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University, as well as engaging with other on-campus activism. And I think something that I'm thinking about is over the summer, I had the pleasure to meet a wonderful scholar and activist by the name of Dr. Hooker. And I was with a group of students learning and thinking about different issues related to what we've been talking about this weekend. And he posed to us the question, in the world we say we want, none of us can be who we are right now. What do you have to give up? Find where you stand, figure out who you are supposed to be in the world that you want, and start being that. So since this experience, I've really been grappling with the question of who am I in the world that I want and how can I start being that person now? And also, what do spaces like Brown University look like in the world that we are collectively unbuilding and building? And another person that I met over this program was a Professor Kinnison, who's a lawyer and advocate for Indigenous rights and sovereignty, and she said to all of us that she's the way she uses the law has helped framed kind of my thinking towards the university, like universities such as Brown, which is that they can provide us with the tools to fight liberation, but they in and of themselves are not tools for liberation. So I just have been thinking and reminding myself that I here as a student at Brown, as someone speaking on this panel, didn't get here solely because of my hard work, but also because of the family and the body into which I was born. And I say this because I really do think that the first part of this work is that piece of critical self-reflection and interrogating the ways in which we each relate to the work that we're all doing. So just to a quick anecdote is that my sophomore year of college was in a course called Locked Up. It was the history of prisons and captivity, and the professor who taught the course on Brown's campus was also teaching the course in the Rhode Island prison. And I went, and then a couple years later, the next semester I went to TA with College Unbound in the Rhode Island prison and was introducing myself to some of the students in the class, and two of them came up to me and said, "Your voice sounds really familiar. Were you on the recording that we received?" Because they were taking the same exact course taught by the same professor at the same time, and the professor had found a way to facilitate communication past Brown University's famous gates, which they love to put on all of their publicity material, and the gates of the prison through these recordings. And we realized that we were classmates and had been conversing with each other and posing questions through these recordings. And here we are, where we were against constructed odds in the same room. So something that I've been left thinking about, though, in the major problem was that there's lots of major problems, but we've been talking about this all weekend, but one of the problems was that I was receiving course credit from Brown University for that work, and my classmates were not, despite the fact that we were doing the exact same work at the exact same time with the exact same professor. So something that I've been thinking about as a student at Brown University is the fact that the same logic that deems me as being worthy to be at Brown, when the university likes to tout its small acceptance rate, is also used to deem other people unworthy and put in prison. So I'm just thinking about the fact that I think I need to critically interrogate the role that I play in these systems. The prison industrial complex, Brown is also a part of that, as well as other institutions. So I'm excited to talk more.
Thank you so much, Sophie. We don't have a lot of time, but I did want to just ask the panelists also to share with us what is a tactic that you think that we need to bring about the liberatory future that we're looking for? What kind of movement do we need to build? And is there a front that you're thinking about that we are not yet struggling on that we should be struggling on? So you can choose any one of those three things. And actually, we won't go down the line. Sophie, do you want to start off?
All right, thank you. So just going off of what I just shared and these questions that I've been asking myself, some of the work that I'm trying to do as a student is to think critically about how to both redistribute the resources of the university and to challenge and pressure the university to think critically about the ways in which it's related to the prison industrial complex and to shift its practices. So one example is a graduate student, Kristen May, and I got money from the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice to start a reading group focused on the carceral state. And something that we've been thinking about and trying to build is a third space that is using the money and the funds from the university, but looks very different than your traditional university classroom. So together, we're trying to build a space, and we've begun to do so this semester for Brown University students, but also for people involved in different sectors of the Providence community, particularly those most directly impacted by the criminal legal system, to come together to use these funds to get hot meals at every single one of our meetings, to provide child care and transportation for folks to get to the meetings, to meet not just on Brown's campus, which is not a welcoming place for a lot of people, but different places around the city, and to work to critically interrogate texts together, to share our thoughts and our experiences, and to do so in a way that looks different from other classrooms. So one thing that I'm thinking of is just how can we use the resources we have access to at our institutions, whether it's free printing for a community organization that's doing flyering, or resources to create third spaces, not as a way to, just as a step towards this deconstructing and rebuilding that we're all doing.
Thanks. Ophelia?
Yeah, just to, what I've been doing recently, I've been teaching for like 17 years, and usually I teach it as a racial kind of, looking at prisons as a racial project as they emerged out of the plantation, the reservation, the internment camps, right? That they have a historical kind of racial history, which is why there is a disproportionate number of black and brown folks in prisons. And after about 15 or 16 years of doing this, I had to come up with an answer, and I had to come up with a solution. And this is actually related to, I forgot to say that I'm the guest editor for Public's Journal on mass incarceration. Yeah, I know, I forgot to say that earlier. And what I had kind of, to bring it back to how I was talking about California, I told all the students after they learned this long kind of national history about prison buildings and race, I'm like, I want you, and understanding the political economy of like that California prison building that I talked about, those 28 years where, the 28 new prisons where we were building a prison a year during the 1990s, to pick one of the prisons, find out how much it cost to build, even San Quentin, how much it cost to run yearly, and how much it costs to house an inmate per year. So for example, San Quentin is about a $1.5 billion budget per year. It costs anywhere from $48,000 to $65,000 a year, depending on what prison, to house an inmate, okay? And where that kind of, and I asked them to build me something different, make me something different with that money, which was totally related to what you were talking about earlier, Lisa. And you know, and what that was kind of predicated on, and again, I think this has a lot to do with what you were talking about, is at some point during the class period, I asked those students, what makes you feel safe and secure? Never is it jail and policing. It's always things like knowing when I call home my family's safe, knowing that there's gonna be food to eat, knowing that there's going to be, I have a place to go, right? And the list is long and extensive. So I said, taking those things that make you feel like your life is safe and secure, use those kind of characteristics of space and time in your life and build me something with that prison money, right? Build me, and Pelican Bay becomes an art academy, a dance theater university. San Quentin became a marine biology research center plus amusement park. I mean, and I had them go down to, tell me how many workers, tell me how many researchers. They came down like to the point of, it cost this much for the ferry to go back and forth to San Quentin and parking. I have them do an absolutely detailed kind of layout of that, and that's what I've done so far.
That's great. Danny.
So when I think about transformative imaginations and decarceration, liberatory futures, for me, one of the things that I'm trying to deal with is organizing those that have been, deemed the wretched of the earth, right? Someone who used to be me, that gangbang, that dude that was out there on the block banging and selling dope, And so I'm thinking about how do we organize, I'm from California, right? So we have Sureños, Norteños, Bloods, Crips, 415510, how do we organize these people, right, that are still on the streets and, not, but already kind of on that path to incarceration or an early death, right? And so I'm still trying to figure out how do we start organizing people that have been thrown away, right? And one way that I'm doing that is now I'm in a position where people are writing to me, and sometimes people that used to be my enemies or my false enemies, right? Because I've been conditioned to think that they were my enemies. But anyways, I'm writing letters to the parole board, and people are writing to me like, hey, Danny, can you write a letter to the parole board for me on my behalf? I'm going home. And when, two people got out, right? One was a norteño who I wrote a letter for. A northerner, I'm a southerner from Southern California. He's from Northern California. In prisons, there's this divide, right? Geographic divide. And when he wrote me and he told me, hey, thank you, what do I owe you? I go, you don't owe me nothing. But what I want to do is how do me and you collaborate and bring our people together, right? And then there was another situation just last week, someone from my community, who was also my enemy. If, 25 years ago, we probably would have killed each other. We've seen each other in the streets. I wrote a letter to the parole board, and same thing, like, dude, what do I owe you? The mom, even like, whenever you come down to LA, come to my house, I'm gonna cook for you, I'm gonna do this and all that. And so I told him, same thing, like, how can me and you work together to put an end to the violence that has been impacting our communities since the 1960s? Both of our communities have been at war since the 1960s, and so many of our brothers and sisters have been murdered, and what I wanna see is, I wanna see mothers stop burying their children. And that's what I see, and the work that I'm trying to do.
Sarah.
The work that I'm thinking about now is kind of what Bernadine was talking about, of like sort of starting with the hardest. I mean, there's so many hardest, so that's, there's many you can pick from, but we work with folks at Stateville Prison, which is a maximum security prison, which people have incredibly long sentences, and before that I worked with folks at a medium security prison who people were doing 20, 25, 35 years, and so the work that we're thinking about now is how do we actually end life sentences, and how do we get people out of prison, and I think that work is important because I think if we look at people who are deemed as the worst of the worst or whatever, clearly when you look at people and their sentences, they are, the conditions in which their crimes were committed are vast and very different, but they are more than what they did on that one day, right? And so I think if we address issues of life and long sentences, then we will absolutely talk about harm and how to change frameworks of harm. Where is harm committed? Oftentimes people they suffer harm from the state itself, from the police itself, and so I think that by starting with, or the work we've been doing in the last 2 years is around long-term sentencing, and we developed a book project and an art exhibition that will travel throughout the city for the year. There's interviews from family members, interviews from people who serve long terms, and then work made by people who are currently incarcerated who all die in prison until we change laws. And so our work is to have this sort of creative work in community centers, in neighborhood galleries, to invite people in to have conversations about, how long is long? When we're talking about issues of harm, and where does harm come from, and how do we kind of get to some of the things that Danny was saying as well. So thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Vincent.
Yeah, so so I've been really thinking a lot about the stance that we need to have as scholars and as activists. So, and to kind of couch this, I'll just kind of tell you about 3 things I've heard recently and how I'm reacting to them. One was just yesterday. Michelle Jones was in a workshop with us. So amazing woman, formerly incarcerated, and she had said, kind of off the cuff, we are in a very punitive stage right now, a time in which it's really hard to build community. So that was one thing. Talking to one of the court-ordered youth that I've been working with in Costa Rica who have come from the United States to work there, she had said, I feel whether I was in or I was out, I felt confined. And now here in nature, in the forest, working on myself, I'm feeling that release. The gentleman that came with me, the farmer and the activist, I actually brought him. He was here for the workshop, a very wise person. I asked him this morning, how are you doing? You know, we went to the play last night and we've been here, and anytime I've traveled with him before in the States, he gets really quiet. He's not a quiet person. And he said, every time I come to the States, I feel constrained. And I said, oh yeah, you know, you live in the forest, of course. Everything's inside in the United States. And he said, no. It's time. I feel constrained by time and space, but I have this feeling that I can't move. So I started thinking about that, and I thought, we as scholars and activists come into contact with people all the time who are not confined, who are fighting that confinement every day out. And it's a hard fight. It's not easy, especially now when there's so much rage and so much anger. And our almost visceral response now is to respond with anger. And I guess for me, that stance, we have to ensure a different kind of stance than anger, than punitive in our response to anger and punitive and constraining things. And so I started thinking, I've started working with an indigenous group on the east side of Costa Rica recently called the Bribri. And I was in a conversation with one of the elders, and I was talking a little bit about this and some other things, and he was telling me about a role. Everybody has roles in this tribe, each clan. And he said, we have a certain person or a group sometimes of people that we call Tasirik. And that translates loosely as the one who pushes the leaves out of the way so that others may follow. And what he was saying was, in the forest, it's extremely dark. And what we need are people who can push those leaves out of the way. That's our responsibility, so that others can follow the trail we take. That's not an angry movement. That's a graceful movement. It's a movement in hope. It's a movement in strategy. And it's a movement in body. And I think that's what I'm thinking a lot about and thinking about. We're not just talking about incarceration. We're talking about overall confinement and our potential liberation.
Well, everyone, it's been such an honor to sit on the stage with you. Before this conference ends, I want to invite each of you to reach out to a stranger that you've not yet talked to, introduce yourself, and share with one another a strategy of what you are doing in your daily life, your practice to really help create this liberatory future. This is I say this without any irony. I'm sort of the timekeeper, and so for the fierce urgency of now, it's actually 4 o'clock. We have to end this panel now, and I'm going to please join me in thanking this amazing group of people. Been on the stage. This weekend has been extraordinary. I thank you for being here, and we're going to turn it over to Erica to share with us some news, right?
Lisa, I know you and Erica are the timekeepers, but I just want to ask you, are you posting books, and I don't mean academic, well, I do mean academic, but I mean, I have a whole list here of things I'd like to have people read and read together, or videos, or films, or plays, or whatever your form is, but it just seems so urgent.
Thank you. We can absolutely do that, and it's been requested more than once throughout the last 3 days, so thank you. Thank you, panelists, so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for coming this year. I am beyond thrilled to say that I hope to see you all next year, about the same time next year, to celebrate Imagining America's 20th anniversary in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Yeah. So I look forward to seeing you there. We'll have a number of really exciting partnerships, including the University of New Mexico. So we'll have more soon on that. Thanks for, oh, yep.
And one more thing, I just want to thank Lisa Wagner, who is our ASL translator over there. Yay, for all of her work. Good. All right, safe travels, everyone, and stay in touch.